So my name is Joe Antolin. I'm serve as the Executive Director of the Asset Funders Network, and we're excited to be part of this panel this morning. I'm going to let each of the speakers introduce themselves, but but I will say that there's at least 3 new reports that are from this panel, and Clinton Boyd is going to be focusing on Black Wall Street.
Yes, with the historic Hayti district.
So it's a pretty wide-ranging discussion, but I think that we'll get to a lot of key topics that'll be of interest to you. And so, Mbalu, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Mbalu Camara, and I'm a third-year PhD student in public policy with an economics concentration at the Sanford School of Public Policy, which is right across the street.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Clinton Boyd, Jr. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity, and I'll be briefly sharing with you all today some of the information I've gathered from the historic Hayti district, a report that I'm putting together.
Hi, I'm William Darity, better known as Sandy. I'm the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. And I want to say at the outset, thank you to Dr. Gwen Wright for the amazing organizational effort she's done here.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Shapiro. I'm the director of the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at the Heller School at Brandeis University. And indeed, it is a pleasure to be here, and my great appreciation to Gwen as well. As you know, I'm one of those that send the last-minute PowerPoints.
So I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about the Asset Funders Network because I'm willing to bet that none of you have heard of it. The Asset Funders Network is a philanthropy supporting organization, but we're a little bit different than a lot of philanthropy supporting organizations because we include financial institutions at the table that we convene. It's a national organization. It's focused on 7 different issue areas that are about asset building and wealth building, because we think that the focus has been for too long in this country and in philanthropy on income and not wealth building. We're pretty new. We've been in existence 11 years, but the truth is we've only been a national organization with members across the country in 6 years. We gather regional tables as well as state and city focus tables around the country. One of our projects actually is a Southern debt reduction initiative where our last convening was in Durham, where we're trying to focus on medical, student debt, and fees and fines, and which are all wealth stripping activities of institutions. It has nothing to do with what individuals do or don't do or choose. It has to do with the way the system is stacked against folks. And I don't mean to sound like our president in saying something is stacked against folks. The reason we're here is that in 2015, we engaged Dr. Mariko Chang-Pyle to focus on the women's wealth gap. At the time, we were concerned that all of the women's foundations and all of the focus of the advocacy was on the women's income gap and not the wealth gap. And in comparison to the income gap, the wealth gap was 4 or 5 times greater. In general, what we found in that first brief, after she had gone through the research and really sort of digested it for researchers, which can be found at assetfunders.org and our website, in which she just presented the same research to a House committee looking at the wealth gap, is that women have less than 10 cents to the dollar of men in terms of wealth, and Black and Latinx women have literally nothing in compared to white men in terms of their wealth, right? Those numbers have changed a little bit over the years, but not much. that led us to sit down and talk to a bunch of funders and say, what should we be doing about this? Because one of the things that we discovered was that nobody was investing in strategies to grow women's wealth in any intentional way. It was happening accidentally. Since then, with the help of the Texas Women's Foundation, the Chicago Foundation for Women, the New York Foundation for Women, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Prudential, we've been able to sort of fund a series of briefs focusing on millennial women, women who are 45 to 65, women who are business owners and entrepreneurs, where Sandy and Mbalo were the chief authors, and we're really grateful for the work that they've done. One more to be coming out about what happens, what are the predatory practices that harm women once they've retired. That whole series is galvanizing a group of funders and advocates and researchers into what's called the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative, which is really focusing on how do you have intentional strategies, how do you launch public policy changes in a state-by-state basis. Most of this won't be federal, most of this will be local. And so we feel very proud of that whole effect, and we think that this research, this briefing is helping to get people to a common language, which is really, if you've done any advocacy, you know that common language and common facts are really key to sort of moving the needle forward. A couple of things that I quickly wanted to say here is that just sort of foundationally, by 2015, nearly 2 out of 3 mothers in U.S. households were either the primary, or at least providing a co-breadwinner in the household, providing at least 25% of income in the household. It's probably not news to you, but reducing it to a statistic is helpful. That the long-term financial security of American families obviously is tied to women in a way that we still have a lot of systemic assumptions that deny that fact. When you look at women's businesses, they're growing at a fast rate, but what we learned is that less than 2% of capital is being made available to women's businesses. So despite the growth, the system's really not there to support them. And as a result, they don't grow as much, they're not as big of a wealth producer. There's all kinds of problems in terms of what that limits in terms of our economy. And I'm the least expert of the folks here at this panel, so I'm going to not say anything more about that. I think the other issue is that it's not just women, but then when you sort of do the intersection of women and race, particularly Latinx and Black women are much more handicapped by the systems and the biases that exist in our markets, and that has to change. So the more that we call it out, the more that we shine a spotlight on it, the more that we try and get folks at our tables to be thinking about intentionally reversing that, the more possibility there is. There are 4 things that our brief, that the asset funders brief on women owners really pointed out, and that is that there is a lack of access to capital. The sector segregation continues to be a problem in terms of how much potential wealth can be generated, how much of a share of the economy women have, that there are not enough supportive networks and mentors for women as business owners, and that business education and training is not something that we are fostering among women in our higher education institutions or in other ways. And so these are all things that can be intentionally fixed moving forward. And we have a lot of suggestions that our authors help to research that are working in various places. None of them are what you would call viral or easily found in more than one place. So we need to do a lot of work in that area. So I'm going to cut it at that point, but we have these 5 briefs that help to sort of create a foundation. We're trying to get financial institutions and national and regional and local funders to rethinking about this, to sort of rethink where they're putting their money, and hopefully we can change the pattern here. And with that, Balu, would you like to be the first one, or Dr. Darity? Okay. Are you speaking? It's up there.
Okay. Make sure I know how to do this. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Sandy.
I just learned a couple of days ago that although I'm not a routine coffee drinker, as many people are, that for health reasons, I should be drinking more coffee. So I'm going to start this morning after my presentation is over. So the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity is focused on inequality, the scope of inequality, and remedies for inequality. And our emphasis has been on 5 areas: education, employment, health, wealth, and political participation. And we've been concerned about examining inequality both from an individual standpoint and a group level. At the group level, our stress has been on race, ethnicity, gender, and religious differences. In the context of this particular conference, we want to explore an allied arena, business ownership, and with a particular stress here on business ownership differences by race and gender. With support from Ted Archer and JP Morgan Chase, we have been urged to contribute to an evidence-based foundation for the design of positive change with respect to racial differences in business ownership. This has resulted in 2 reports, one of which we developed at the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center in conjunction with the Institute on Assets and Social Policy. That report is the one that I'm going to talk about this morning, called Entering Entrepreneurship. There's a companion report that we've collaboratively developed with the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University, which is called Redefining Risk, and Tom Shapiro will talk about that shortly. Entering Entrepreneurship is devoted to an analysis of the ways in which folks become business owners, while Redefining Risk focuses on the ways in which people exit from business ownership. So essentially, we're covering both ends of the bookshelf. In addition, as Joe Antolin mentioned, we also prepared a report called Unlocking Assets for the Asset Funders Network, which is on women, wealth, and business ownership. So in my initial remarks, which I'm going to share the stage with Mbalu Camara, who has helped co-author Entering Entrepreneurship. In my initial remarks, I'm going to draw upon Entering Entrepreneurship, but I'm also going to draw upon some elements of the report that we prepared for the Asset Funders Network. So let me begin by talking about the landscape of racial business ownership gap, the landscape. That landscape actually is quite staggering in its dimensions. Okay. So if we look at the left portion of this slide, we report on evidence that the top American Fortune 500 firms each generate more in annual revenue than all of the black-owned businesses combined. Okay. If you look at the upper right-hand portion of this, you can see that Walmart has $514 billion in revenue, 2.2 million employees, while the top 100 black-owned firms taken together have $24 billion in revenue and less than 74,000 employees. So these are immense differences in the scope of what we might refer to as corporate white America versus the conditions for corporate black America. In fact, it does raise the question as to whether or not we can actually refer to the black business world as one that has corporate characteristics at all. To reinforce the magnitude of these differences, we also looked comparatively at employer firms and non-employer firms. And so by an employer firm, we mean a firm that has at least one additional employee besides the individual who is the owner of the operation. A non-employer firm, the only person who is participating in the activities of that firm from a pecuniary standpoint is the individual who is the owner of the firm. So if you will look at the left side of this slide, you can see that 79% of all white-owned businesses are non-employer firms, but it is 96% of all black-owned businesses. And furthermore, 7.7% of the sales revenues from white-owned businesses are attributable to non-employer firms, but it is closer to 30% from black-owned businesses. If you look at the upper portion of the slide here, you can see that black-owned employer firms average about $666,000 in annual revenue. These are mean statistics, and they provide their employees with an annual salary of approximately $23,000 or $24,000, while white-owned employee firms have $2 million in annual revenue on average and provide their employees with $33,690 in annual salary. So the dean of the business school said a moment ago that it's not an IQ problem, and he's definitely correct about that. There's an immense passion on the part of black Americans for business ownership. Black Americans are almost twice as likely to start a business compared to white Americans. Between 2007 and 2012, black-owned firms grew from 1.9 million to 2.6 million firms, and that's despite the presence of the Great Recession in that interval of time. And black women are the only racial or ethnic group with more business ownership than their male peers. So there's actually an extraordinary degree of interest in business ownership in the black community. The problem is that the opportunity locus is vastly different between blacks and whites in the United States. So in our report, we paid careful attention to the question of how people actually enter into business ownership. How do they acquire a business? And so we started by making the comparison between employer firms and how individuals first come into having possession of employer firms. And so these numbers may not look strikingly different, but there is something very important that's embedded here that's going to be related to the final set of comments that we're going to offer on this report. If you look carefully at the diagram, you can see that there is a much greater rate of entry into business ownership on the part of black owners via startups, starting their own new business operation. In contrast, if you look at the categories of individuals who obtained their business by buying it outright, or by inheriting it, or by receiving it as a gift, as a transfer of ownership as a gift, you can see that consistently the white rate is virtually 2 times as high as the black rate in each of those categories. This is suggestive of a situation in which business acquisition for firms that have at least one employee occurs on a basis that is more linked to prior resources and assets that are held by the individuals who become the new business owners. The results are not quite as marked in terms of the difference when we look at non-employer businesses, but again, there's a slight advantage in terms of purchasing, inheriting, or receiving a gift on the part of white business owners. Finally, in my portion of the presentation, we attempt to provide data on the amount of startup capital that is deployed by black and white businesses depending on their point of entry into this enterprise. And what is striking here again is the extent to which the percent of white-owned employer businesses have far higher levels of initial capital than black-owned employer businesses. So you can compare the black-owned proportions or percentages for different categories of values of startup capital with the white-owned percentages by comparing the column on the left with the column on the right. And in this case, the same kinds of disparities actually do exist when we look at when we look at non-employer firms as well. Here is a description of the source of capital used to start the businesses. Where does the capital come from? And one of the things that, again, is really, really significant here is the extent to which white-owned employer firms actually have a tremendous amount of resources that come directly from personal assets, from family resources and the like, in comparison with black-owned firms. Indeed, one of the things that's very unique is the extent to which black-owned employer firms rely upon credit cards and carrying balances on credit cards as a source of initial startup capital. All right, so I'm going to turn the stage over to Mbalu to complete the presentation on this first report.
Thank you, Sandy. So to sum up the nature of startup capital by race, it is clear that Black American business owners have a limited access to capital relative to their white counterparts. Independent of the scale and the sector of a business, an aspiring entrepreneur requires some form of monetary support. And when you add gender to the discussion, the portrait is even more bleak. In fact, a study finds that the average Black woman-owned startup receives $36,000 in venture funding, while the average white male failed startup receives $1.3 billion in venture capital funding. So together, financing and funding gaps restrict the ability for Black entrepreneurs to enter and to succeed in the entrepreneurial space. And this is especially harmful for Black women, even though recent studies suggest that Black women represent the group that has the fastest growing rate of business ownership.
It's the arrows.
Okay,
Is the arrow on the clicker?
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So the final pattern of initial ownership that we highlight is related to the question of how long ago an employer and non-employer firm was established. Our age of business ownership measure is calculated by taking the survey year, in this case 2016 for employer businesses, and subtracting it to the year that the business was originally established. So what we can conclude from figure 5.1 is that Black-owned firms, Black-owned employer firms, are younger than white-owned employer firms. In particular, looking at the last 3 columns, we can see that 43.6% of all white-owned employer firms were established or are 16 years or older, whereas the number is only 27.1% for Black-owned employer firms. So put simply, close to half of all white-owned employer firms were originally established before the turn of the 21st century, and a majority of Black-owned employer firms that exist as of 2016 were originally started in the 2000s, in the past 2 decades. And I think it's safe to say that this is younger than everyone sitting in this room right now. Maybe not. Younger than me. So similar patterns are found when we look at non-employer firms. As Sandy said, are firms where there are no paid employees other than the owner. So for this category of firms, the most common age in 2012 was between 5 and 12 years. Still, Black-owned firms, as you can all see, are generally younger than white-owned non-employer firms. Looking at the first 2 columns, over a quarter of Black-owned non-employer firms existing in 2012 were 1 year old or younger, definitely younger than everyone here. So what does this age gap mean? Well, the age of a business has implications for business stabilization and whether a business can withstand changing market conditions over time. So older firms, by virtue of their longevity, are more successful, tend to be more stable, more experienced, and generate higher levels of revenue. So one can imagine that the age gap by race can create a serious disadvantage for an aspiring Black business owner who is seeking guidance and mentorship on the business ownership experience. What we find is that most Black-owned businesses are disproportionately located at the lower end of the age distribution. So this reinforces a vicious cycle of hardship for aspiring entrepreneurs who are seeking mentorship, as well as for business owners, Black business owners, who are finding that they cannot provide the experienced or the effective mentorship to other entrepreneurs. So this leads us to our discussion of the key obstacles that drive disparities in the pathway into business ownership. In summarizing the different dimensions on entry into business ownership, how business owners enter, the amount and the source of startup capital, and then the age of the business, we find that Black business owners enter with less, if any, financial and institutional support. The lingering effects of racially motivated historical injustices and hostilities play roles at the entry stage of business ownership. There are historical accounts of explicit acts of violence and disruption of the economic prosperity of Black Americans. And for example, the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, as well as the destruction of Black Wall Street, as you guys will learn more about later today, and when Clinton speaks, are key examples of this. Blacks are less likely than whites to have their business loans approved from financial institutions, and when they are approved, they are much smaller. Black business owners are less likely to benefit from intergenerational business transfers. And finally, the relative lack of social support, either in the form of familial networks or the broader Black community, entails a tougher road to start up for Black business owners. So very little research explores the role of prior wealth as an input, in shaping pathways of business ownership. The influence of initial wealth endowments on the capability of individuals to become business owners demands discussion and implementation of policies that are aimed at closing the racial wealth gap. The median Black household has 10%, and the average Black household has 14.8% of that of the white household. It is vital that we as researchers, as philanthropists, as practitioners, that we tackle business ownership disparities by building Black wealth in advance of the accumulation that may come due to business ownership. So remedies should include public targeting of seed capital for Black entrepreneurs, young adult trust funds in the form of baby bonds, and a direct program of reparations for Black descendants of slaves in this country. So if the aim is to foster an equitable ecosystem for business ownership here in the US, this is merely a start, albeit a very critical and long overdue one. Thank you.
Good morning. So while we're getting my presentation up, just a few acknowledgments, if you will. First and second, in no particular order, to Ted Archer and the foundation at JP Morgan Chase that were very generously supported the work for what we think are some really significant questions, and hopefully we're able to grab a bunch of answers to those questions that will lead us forward. And then to Mbalu and Sandy and their team at the Cook Center for partnering with us on this great venture, where we each tried to take slightly distinct parts of very, very similar questions. And we especially enjoyed the great travail that researchers always have in working through data organization and how do you figure this question out and that question. And it was great to have a partner many miles away from us. We don't have a printed copy of the report on the table yet. It probably won't be here by the end of the conference. It might be, but it is on our website as of, I hope, as of this morning. And so, like the Cook Center report, this is a premiere of sorts. And just a quick acknowledgement that I stand here, but a lot of other people on my team at IASP helped put this together. So we really started and ended up with three somewhat large research questions. We wanted to look at the life cycle of Black businesses, and especially what that looks like in comparison to white businesses. We wanted to get some information on the question of what does wealth accumulation and or destruction look like in relationship to new businesses. And then third, how does this information help us understand better, get a deeper grasp on the widening racial wealth gap in the United States? And it's been my honor to be in this project over several decades with my good friend and colleague Sandy Darity and a group of other people. So to try and answer these questions, this is the data we gathered. We needed a longitudinal sample. We needed to follow entrepreneurs and families. We needed a data set that had information on family wealth and liabilities. We needed a data set that would ask some questions about business startups. And for us, this comes from the panel study of income dynamics, the 1999 to 2015 waves. We particularly isolated out two cohorts in here. One cohort where the economic environment was relatively stable. We'll call that the 2001 cohort. And we then looked at them and the results on their business survivability and wealth consequences 2, 4, 6, and 8 years out. And then we did the same thing with a 2005 cohort, intentionally wanting a cohort that would begin and go over the Great Recession. And of course, with all data sets, the data is never totally adequate to answer the questions, the very robust questions that we posed. And they certainly doesn't tell us about the dynamics, that is the whys and what the experiences of entrepreneurs are. and what it means in their lives. So we put into play, if you will, several focus groups of Black and Latino entrepreneurs and former entrepreneurs in the Oakland Bay Area and Boston. And so I've got, I think, just a couple of data slides here. So one of the slides, one of the pieces of information that we think is really important, and I think instinctually everybody knows this, but let's put some numbers on it. So the change in median wealth, what wealth was in 2005, and then for business owners, for new business owners, by our determination, what the wealth profile looks like 4 and 8 years out. So for those that continued in business, that is, they survived or sold, we think they survived, the change in wealth is pretty healthy, over $136,000 in net wealth. For those that didn't survive, a destruction of wealth by $65,000. And then if we take that out to the 8-year mark, we see, which now goes over the Great Recession, so I believe that's why the numbers go down, especially for the wealth creation. We see $75,000 change in wealth on the positive side for those still in business, and a destruction of $50,000 for those that did not survive over that particular time period. And that really pounds home that what we already know, that business development can be an incredible promise, but it's also a risk. And it takes a particular kind of people and institutions and capital to make that happen more successfully. All right. Here's my favorite slide. and I hope it works. We wanted to look at that 2005 cohort, and remember, this is the one that's going to go over the Great Recession. And to ask the question, what percent of those that started businesses in 2005, what does their survival look like several years out? So the first line is the line for white entrepreneurs. And it doesn't look good, right? But at least the first couple of years, it sort of is familiar with some national data, but goes down to 15%. This is what the Black entrepreneur line looks like. Now, it's not quite zero, it's a little above zero. Remember, this is the cohort who started businesses in 2005. Right. And I think that really underscores and emphasizes the point that Sandy and his team talked about in terms of what is basically, I think, self-employment and the destruction of that during the Great Recession. Okay. Through a series of regressions, we were trying to ask the question, what drives survivability? And I intentionally don't use the word success here. I think survivability of business is a much better notion for us to play with. And so just a quick two sets for negative factors through a series of regressions. And I think, again, underscoring the work of both of our teams, having to have another job where the business might start out as a side gig, might start out as the main gig, but for a lot of reasons, lack of income, wanting health benefits, health coverage, and other reasons, people start or continue to work at another job. And the regression, the correlation on that is highly significant. Those fail much more quickly. And again, as we reiterate with Sandy's team, less wealth at start. The positive factors that keep coming through are larger businesses at start and more education at start, and the covariance between those is clearly pretty high. I want to turn somewhat briefly to the entrepreneurs, to the focus groups that we talked to. And as I was listening to the previous presentation, especially I think it was the last or second to last slide, where Mbalu talked about the key barriers. Of the themes that came through our focus groups, we hit on 3 of those. So again, as researchers, as people that want to help build a case for more positive outcomes with institutions, funders, and advocates, I think these are pretty critical. And hopefully, this will engender much more work on these. So theme one, if you will, barriers to affordable financial products. And for each of these, I've lifted out a voice of an entrepreneur, formal entrepreneur, and I'll just read it quickly. The whole ecosystem is not really supportive of growth and expansion. It can stimulate the startup because cost for startup, and in this person's view, in the service sector is small. And so continuing support is a much heavier lift and much more costly. So the cry there, the theme there, is not just to help us open the door and hang the shingle out of being open, but it's the continuing support throughout the life cycle of a business. Theme two, again resonating with the prior report, interpersonal, institutional, systemic racial discrimination. One person. We're getting charged, this is my favorite, and I don't have the whole quote there, we're getting charged extra for exactly the same thing. Every place else, they're giving it away for free. And this person then talked about when they go into the equivalent of a Kentucky Fried Chicken or a Burger King in a minority community, that when you ask for extra things like tomato slices, you get charged. And the business gets charged. But when you go to that same place in a relatively well-to-do white community, if they're Burger Kings and Kentucky Fried Chickens in those places, there is no charge. Wow. And so it's what I call snarkily, the condiment theory of institutional discrimination. But it's much more than condiments. Theme three, a mismatch in community resources. And this was from a former entrepreneur who talked about, in her voice, we need to visit 3 or 4 different places getting services, 1 to 2 hours at a time. It's like going to an economic emergency room. But small businesses' needs are not treatable in the ER. They are long-term needs over the economic life of the business. Joe, Antolin, we may come back to this about some networks for mentors and other ideas. Theme 4, and I probably should have started with this, because it is very robust and in a way aspirational, inspiring when we hear people talk about this, and it's not just out of a Business 101 textbook. The promise of a promise among many promises of entrepreneurship. I do feel like being in my own business gives me more opportunities than when I was in corporate America. I'm glad I decided to leave from corporate America because even with all the challenges of running your own business, I feel like a little more in charge of my own destiny. That's, I believe, what we all want, in some way, to be a little bit more in charge of our own destiny. And for us, and this may be a topic for conversation for all of us as well. I think one can easily make a historical case around the legacy of race and business in the United States, that the promise of entrepreneurship may be more profound for African Americans because of that history and being segregated and pushed and discriminated out of so-called normal, conventional markets in the first place. That there's a sort of, in the phrase of a great old economist, an economic detour at operation here. So I would like to leave it at there and maybe then take up some common solutions as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Give me 1 second, people. Hello, is this on? Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. My name again is Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr., and I have the pleasure of sharing with you all some of the historical work that I've been engaged in over the past month or so that will lead to a white paper that is near completion. It's been somewhat difficult for me to collect all of the necessary source material because the focus of my report deals with the social class tensions in Durham's historic Hayti district. And as you can tell by the beginning of the title, no longer blinded by nostalgia, there tends to be this deified understanding that we have of Durham's Black Wall Street, and for good reason. In many instances, it is considered to be the capital of the black middle class, and it was the Wall Street of Black America at its inception. But it's also important to take into consideration that the rise of Durham's Black Wall Street occurred against the backdrop of widespread racial terror campaigns. And so when you think about many of the founding fathers of the Hayti district being Richard Fitzgerald, William G. Pearson, John Merrick, Dr. Aaron M. Moore, Charles C. Spalding, and James E. Shepard, these were men who in many instances represented the black intelligentsia. They represented the black aristocracy. These were individuals who understood that the rise of Hayti depended fully on their ability to negotiate with the white business elite of that day, specifically Washington Duke and Julian Carr. And so for those of you all who may not be familiar with Washington Duke, he was the owner of perhaps the largest tobacco factory in the country at that time. And at the same time, he is also the benefactor of Duke University. And so what you see is that a great deal of blacks began to travel into Durham in the aftermath of Reconstruction, because at that point you saw a lot of blacks who were fleeing the oppression associated with the Jim Crow South. And so typically when we had these stories about the push and pull factors, there's a great deal of consideration given towards blacks fleeing the Deep South and headed to the industrialized North, and also the industrialized Midwest. And so specifically what makes Durham unique in many ways is you literally had millions of black folks who were leaving the state of North Carolina. However, you saw a significant increase in the number of blacks who were traveling into Durham specifically. And that had a great deal to do with the work opportunities that existed here, and also a great deal to do with the whole notion that Durham was, Black Durham specifically, was a place of racial peace among whites and blacks. And so you had blacks coming into Durham who were a part of the working class and who were poor, but you also had a lot of blacks who came into Durham who were college educated. And many of the blacks who came into Durham that were college educated landed jobs at the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company. However, a lot of the blacks who came into Durham who were part of the working poor and were just poor outright, they found themselves working within the textile and tobacco factories. And it's important for me to note that while these individuals were making their inroads into new occupations, there was occupational sorting, occupational segregation that was taking place that really led to some inequitable pay outcomes, or what can also be referred to as systemic wage and benefit inequalities. And I think this again is a part of why it's important to highlight the social tensions that existed within the Hayti district, because many of the foundational leaders of Hayti, unfortunately, this was something that they did not deal with forthrightly in their handling with the white business class of that day, and understandably so, given their position. For example, individuals like John Merrick and Charles C. Spalding, who were both the respective presidents of North Carolina Mutual Insurance, they were paying close attention to all of the white terror campaigns that were going on throughout the country. And so, for example, it was referenced earlier, the Tulsa race riot. Then also here in the state of North Carolina, you had the Wilmington race riot in 1898. And so from their perspective, they understood that in order for us to maintain some type of working relationship with the white business class and continue to have Black Durham operate as a illusionary utopia of racial peace among whites and blacks, they had to walk a delicate tightrope. And so, unfortunately, this was not something that they dealt with specifically in terms of the workplace racial inequality within the tobacco and textile industries, because they didn't want to ruffle any feathers. However, upon me doing some of the archival work, I came across a gentleman named Louis E. Austin, who is the founder of the Carolina Times. Now, in much of my reading on what was going on in the Hayti during the times of Black Wall Street and the historic Hayti district, Louis E. Austin is vaguely referenced. And when he is referenced, not much attention is paid to him being a spokesperson for the racial inequities that pervaded the historic Hayti district at that time. And so upon me going and doing a deeper dive around many of the publications that came out during his stint as the editor of the Carolina Times, it became very evident to me that it was a reason why the founding fathers of Hayti specifically made it a priority to downplay his significance and influence within the Hayti district, because he was considered a more radical leader in the Black community. And he was somebody who really was about speaking truth to power. And it was evident in every single one of his publications that came out during his stint as editor with the Carolina Times. And so just to give you all a couple of examples of some of the racial injustices that he spoke out against, there was a great deal of police misconduct and brutality that was very much a part of the daily experiences of Black Durhamites in the Hayti district. Then you also had extrajudicial murders, and then he was also somebody who made it a priority to speak out against unjust impoverishment. And he highlighted that by paying close attention again to the unequal pay and the inhumane work conditions that were taking place within the textile and also tobacco factories. And quite frankly, based off of my reading of the literature on the Hayti district, and I also have to give a great deal of credit to Leslie Brown and a lot of the work that she did in her seminal book that to really unearth a lot of the gross injustices that were taking place at this time. However, it's something unique about Louis E. Alston and his ability to put out very inflammatory reports and publications against the backdrop of white terror campaigns that was still alive and well at that time. And an interesting fact about Louis E. Alston is he actually migrated to Durham from Wilmington. And so it's important, again, to highlight that as well, because he had a different worldview and orientation given some of what he experienced in his own personal life. And so just to give you all just a couple of examples of the editorials that came out under his leadership, this was one that focused, the headline is Negro Home Dynamited. And then at the above that, you see where it says women forced to work in water up to their knees. Then you have another publication where he is making it a priority to call for equal pay among the women who were working within the Durham, the black women who were working within the Durham school district, specifically Hillside High School. And so I'll just, and then again, equal salaries for Negro teachers. Like, this was something that was very big for him. And when you just think about that in the context of the panel that we're having, cash is one particular asset that you need in order to amass capital and amass wealth. And so if you have a particular segment of the black community that has been denied systematically just wages because they were being sorted to the assembly line, whereas the whites who were also working in these factories were the machine operators who were afforded higher wages. And in many instances, they had benefits that didn't necessarily trickle down to the blacks who were working on the assembly line and who were being deprived of the type of wages that would be suggestive of them being quality workers within that space. And when you think about this happening against the backdrop of residential and racial segregation, it diminishes the buying power of an entire segment of the population. So while there is much to be said about Durham's Black Wall Street, arguments can also be made, had they been paid just compensation, they would have been able to do more within their respective community, because they would have had more cash that would have ultimately led to more capital. And so I'll just leave you all with that.
Questions? Questions? Don't be shy.
Good morning. Thank you all for a really scintillating panel. I have a question for Dr. Boyd. I was wondering while you were talking if members of the black business class who survived the Wilmington riot in 1898 came to Durham, because that's exactly the same year that the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company was founded. And so I was really pleased to hear that Alston was from Wilmington. Do you know anything about was he a journalist when he lived in Wilmington? Do you know anything about who set him up in business when he came here? I guess I've been really interested in who set up these black businesses in Durham, because they didn't have capital, right? So where did the money come from? But do you know if there were was there like a mass exodus of those black business people in Wilmington who came to Durham? Is that part of the story? Do you know that?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm in the process of trying to figure this out. And I say that because much of the historical record has been difficult to find and identify, because what happened in Wilmington, as many of you well know, was basically a coup d'etat, as Professor Darity frequently alludes to, where you had a populist movement that had gained political leadership in Wilmington, but at the same time, it came at a cost to the white male hegemony. And it was a concerted effort on the behalf of the conservative elements of the Democratic Party at that day to take back government and to disenfranchise African Americans across the board. And they were very successful in doing that. And as a result, you had, again, this mass exodus of blacks from Wilmington who went north and who went to the Midwest, and some of them did migrate to Durham, but I have been yet to find good, solid evidence of the sheer number of blacks who migrated to Wilmington. And unfortunately, in terms of Lewis Alston, I really haven't been able to find or identify anything that speaks to his personal biography outside of him being the founding editor of the Carolina Times. And so this is something that has been keeping me up late at night, because I wanted to put forth a compelling story, and having that type of information would allow me to do so in a very thoughtful and well thought out way.
Thank you very much.
There's a question here.
Good morning, Terrence White. This question is really for anybody on the panel. I was wondering if there was any data in regards to black businesses that did receive any type of funding or venture capital, the amount of control or equity they was able to maintain in their company.
So the magnitude of venture capital that goes to black-owned businesses is so small that it's really hard to answer that. What's the estimate we came up with for the amount of venture capital going to black women? It's
2%.
less than
2%.
Yeah.
I think it's
No, to all women it's about 2%. It's 0.2% for black women. Yeah. So it's really difficult to answer your question, because there's not much data to draw upon since the numbers are so low.
You're more likely to see investment in businesses through CDFIs or other nonprofit financial institutions, and their financing is limited by what they get from foundations from the bigger banks or from governmental programs, many of which are under attack. So the entire system is undercapitalized.
Yeah, so I would maybe add another research question to this, and that is, I think it would be really intriguing for us to get a better understanding of, are there more controls that venture capital and other initial financing has over female entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color compared to the white entrepreneurs? Because there's going to be control all over. And I think it's a question of us understanding what those strings look like, and are they different, are they tighter, do things get pulled back more quickly? Does the plug get pulled more quickly?
It's also a question of, what are the business, the investors' neutral set, and I say neutral in quotes, of risk factors and how they're judging it, and I think that has to be influenced by community and state.
First of all, thank you for raising, our awareness and shedding light on the gender and racial disparities. Obviously, as a Black woman who is a business owner, along with my sister-in-law, who's actually Latina. And so we are definitely facing firsthand this issue with being able to get enough capital to expand our business. So right now, we're mainly functioning as consultants, as experts in our field. But we're barely breaking even most of the time. So my question is, now that we're aware of these disparities and what some of the issues are that are causing, some of those disparities, who has the cash, these venture capitalists or wherever else the funds may be, and who is willing to give to help us build and expand? Because it's a major issue, obviously, but sometimes you don't know where to go or who to go to say, hey, this is our track record, this is what we're doing, this is how we're helping, it's a service-oriented business, but how can we get more cash?
So one of the things that we're trying to do is advocate with financial institutions and foundations to be thinking about this, and JP Morgan Chase, for example, has done that in a few cities. That's hardly, that's not a great answer, but if you happen to be in the south side of Chicago or in the Bronx or parts of Detroit, there is now cash available that's very specific to entrepreneurs of color, which was not there before. And we're talking about significant amounts of money. The problem is that has not been something that has been replicated in a lot of other places, so there's a lot of advocacy still to be done there.
Is it here in Durham?
Not yet, no.
One of the issues is, I think, many of these initiatives can have the effect of altering the absolute position of Black businesses, but very little attention is drawn to whether or not these initiatives actually affect the relative position of Black businesses collectively. So it's one thing to say that we can improve the status of some individual operations or some operations within a particular community versus saying we're actually going to make some progress towards closing those immense disparities that we've talked about. And I'm not sure that there are any initiatives out there that can really close those disparities in the absence of some effort to alter the racial wealth distribution in the first place. Okay, so that's the big issue that we've been trying to raise, which is not to say that these other initiatives should not be pursued, but it is to say it may not be sufficient to eliminate those huge disparities that we've talked about.
So I'm an educator. I'm a professor at Spelman College, and my students here from Spelman and Morehouse are with us. Thank you. Thank you all for this discussion. My name is Wanchella Francis, and I teach several psychology courses, but the one that I specialize in is industrial organizational psychology, which is the study of workplace behavior. I don't know if we can answer the question I'm about to ask, but if there is not a priority driven around pay equity, how is then there a priority in closing the wealth gap?
Well, so one of the reasons we stratified the look at the gender wealth gap was unmarried millennial women actually have not very much of a pay gap anymore than men. But unmarried millennial women are much more likely to have significant student loan debt, and men do not, right? And this starts to then feed into what are we doing in terms of how people are being prepared and getting into the market? What happens when they're there? What's the sectors that they're trained for, and where do they make money? So the wealth gap of these otherwise, we're talking about a few cents of a differential in that generation. The wealth gap is enormous in 10 years for that group. And this is of concern in particular because as we talk about the racial wealth gap, 44%, I think, of the millennial generation are people of color. It's more so in the next generation after that. So, we have to figure these things out in systemic ways so that the playing field is level. And it's more than pay. That's why we're trying to focus on wealth and trying to shift that. I think one of the questions that Sandy has raised is that this question of, businesses that have employees or don't have employees, we need to figure out what are the factors that help to generate, is it just capital, is it training, is it the sort of complex of all things? And maybe you want to,
before you answer, I want to kind of address that because there is still a wage gap in government and corporate and nonprofit.
No, absolutely.
However, if we're not paying our people, I don't call myself a minority, but if we're not paying our women and our African Americans and our Latinas the same amount of money, in many cases, we're not getting funding from the bank. We already see that.
Right.
So most times when we open our own businesses, my husband has his business, he used his own money. So if we don't have the money at the work level, then how do we generate that money back into businesses?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think
So I don't know if those are mutually exclusive, but
That's a key issue. But the one reservation I want to enter into the conversation, though, is I think that we overestimate the connection between income and wealth.
yes.
Okay, and so if we were to close the pay gap, that still would probably not have much of an effect on the wealth gap, okay? Because the primary driver of the wealth gap is intergenerational transfers and transmissions of resources. And so if your parents and your grandparents don't already have a significant foundation in wealth, you won't, regardless of what your earnings are. And so that's the only proviso I want to raise. But you're absolutely correct. We still have significant pay gaps. And they may be masked in some of the ways that you were actually talking about, where there are different labelings on jobs where people are essentially doing very similar tasks, but you can pay one category of folks something different, right?
And Tom?
So I agree that wage gap is an issue, but I want us to be careful about inferring that if we eliminate the wage gap, we also eliminate the wealth gap. I don't know, you may have.
As usual, Professor Darity is absolutely right. And I would add that in the middle between income and wealth, benefits.
Right.
And the prime, besides healthcare, a prime benefit is pensions
And retirement.
and retirement savings.
Yeah.
And to plug a report that we issued about 2 months ago, it's called Not Only an Uneven Paycheck. When we do an analysis of benefits and what industries and sectors have access to benefits and what size of firms have access to benefits, and we map that over and draw a bridge to occupational segregation by race and gender, we see very clearly that it's workers of color that don't have nearly the same amount of access to benefits, and to the extent to which that is a bit of a help along the way from income to wealth, that is an institutional and advocacy mechanism that we need to pay much more attention to.
I don't make a lot of money teaching Spelman, but my husband probably wouldn't be able to have the 3 businesses he has without me having the job with the benefits.
Right, the security that comes from that. Those of us that have that privilege, we don't have to save for our retirement nearly the same way.
The Closing the
way we think
Women's
about
Wealth
risk
Gap
is very different.
I was just going to say the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap initiative, which would love to have any of you join it, is focused on also paid leave and paid maternity leave, because those are the 2 biggest factors in sort of driving some of these gaps.
Okay, we have time for just one question.
Okay.
Anyone can kind of take this one. So Daryl Cavett here, VP of private equity firm, Pax Equity. Just want to kind of get you guys' thoughts on maybe kind of speaking to crowdfunding, specifically how that could be a solution to how I think she kind of addressed it and a few others, to kind of making or kind of clearing the disparities from a capital raising standpoint to help find the equity that people need to fund their businesses. So specifically crowdfunding under the Job Act of 2012 that was passed under Barack Obama's administration. How knowledgeable or how aware or have you guys seen much data on that and kind of equalizing things to help address some of these issues that we're discussing today?
I've never heard anybody propose that crowdfunding was a solution to this situation.
I mean, yeah, it's the Jobs Act, right? So small businesses finding ways to raise capital. As you probably know, for many of, all of 60 years of securities regulations, many people were unable to even raise capital if they weren't accredited investors, right? So essentially that allowed for non-accredited investors to be able to access these markets. So I just wanted to know if you guys were maybe aware of that, had any data to kind of speak to how that may address and cure some of these issues that we're discussing.
It's an intriguing question. Those of us on the panel were looking kind of quizzically at each other, which one of us knows anything about this?
That's right.
And the answer is, I don't think we're aware of any data out there.
Yeah.
They are intriguing questions, and they're certainly worth taking up. My first instinct would be to look at what's the size of, how much of startup capital comes from those kinds of sources, and that would give us an idea of scope to work with.
Another factor is in some states there is what's being referred to as a tsunami of transfer of ownership from baby boomers that finally decide to retire. And will that become, gobbled up by bigger corporate entities, or will it become something that ends up, with the people who have worked there for a long time and it continues to be a business? And will it be a cooperative of some sort, a shared ownership model? I think we're seeing a lot of discussion about that. There's some states that are more their laws are more favorable to co-op ownership, and I think in places we'll see some of that happening. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. It's a different way to sort of think of how do you capitalize it.
Yeah, I mean, in short, it allows you to raise up to $1 million. So for all these small businesses, that obviously is enough to be able to kind of bypass the banks, go directly into the market to raise capital through like some type of crowdfunding platform to fund their businesses. And they can do it across hundreds of people as opposed to going to a bank, not being favorable to the banks, and then essentially kind of giving less debt share to their businesses. So, and I just wanted to see if that was something that you guys looked at.
So that's our keynote speaker tomorrow.
Sure. Hi, everyone. First and foremost, thank you so much for all the amazing research that you've done. My question, and I'm not sure if you can completely answer this, but given the experts we have, I'm curious about your perspective. And that is, what's the goal? And whose responsibility is it to pursue the goal? So for example, one stat that we often see is that 2% of VC funding goes to women, and minuscule percentages go to women of color. Is the goal something like in 10 years we expect that to be 5%? And that's just an example. And in 20 years we would like for that to be 10%. But what's the goal? Because descriptives give us a lot of information, and they open our eyes, and we're like, oh my goodness, these things that some people may not be aware of. But these stats we've been aware of for a long period of time. So the question that I'm curious about, and recognizing that, not saying you should attempting to tackle that or anything, but if you've given any thought to what the actual metric of success looks like over a time period, because we've been at these numbers for a substantial amount of time.
So my metric for success is that if we're thinking about achieving equality and equity, we need to make sure that various groups in our society have resources that are comparable to their presence in the society. So the relevant metric in terms of gender differences is actually women should get a majority of the venture capital because they are more numerous than men. Okay, so it's not 5% or 10%, it's in excess of 50% that should be the appropriate standard. Now, the related question as to how fast we get from here to there and how we get from here to there, those questions are more difficult ones, obviously. But I don't think that, from my perspective, there's much controversy about what the relevant metric should be. So in similar fashion, if we're thinking about the racial wealth gap, Black Americans have about 2% to 3% of the nation's wealth, but constitute about 13% of the nation's population. And so the relevant metric there would be Blacks should have at least 13% of the nation's wealth. And so that's how I think about it in terms of proportions of population and proportions of resources. But I don't know if there's other metrics that would be more valuable.
And then there's generally an allergy among many to sort of think about what are the local rules and laws and statutes that sort of preserve the advantage that white men already have. And some of that was, as late as the 1980s, was still very specific and affirmative by gender and by race into the 60s, but those head starts have not been unpacked. So what do you have to do intentionally to start moving towards that 13% or 50+% balancing, and how do you accelerate that? That requires not only speaking truth to power, but taking power.
Yeah. So thank you. Great question. I think the quick conversation we've just had are about the goalposts. And I think the goalposts need to be there. They need to be steady, firmly planted. I'm really interested in how far along that field we're going. I'm interested in us understanding yearly or every other year, whatever time period it is, are we getting closer, staying in place, or moving back? Because that's the way in which advocacy and power building can then help us figure out what's been successful and or what's failed. And then I think in more robust terms, we are, at least I am interested both in equity as well as economic security. And that's both the absolute and the relative notions there. So everybody's getting better, and that gap, if I can use that word, is also closing at the same time. And that's not an easy mechanism to work with. That means targeting.
Volunteer?
Yeah, so I think I may end up answering your question with another question, but I think something that is difficult for a lot of people to measure, especially sitting in a lot of the economics courses I have been for the past 3 years, is how do you match or how do you connect passion or desire or preferences with your outcomes? And so I think there needs to be a lot more research that gets at what people's desires are. And we have found that the passion is there. The passion for business ownership is there for Black Americans and for women. But you see things like women are less likely to seek financing above $100,000 than are men. And I think it's important that when we see a statistic like this, to not think of it as a mindset of seeking less, but rather as something that may reinforce the discriminatory conditions that women have to face. And so we can't talk about changing mindsets of people independent of talking about the discriminatory conditions and the circumstances that women and people of color and Black Americans have to undergo and are confronted with on a daily basis.